I'm going to talk about fundraising, funding, and I'm also going to I throw in a few little things about resources. So yeah, essentially funding is a massive part of building a startup and that startup journey. And so I'm going to try to tackle a few pieces in that space, give you some definitions, and really kind of frame what it looks like as an early stage startup. But first, before I do that, so I know this is a global program. In Australia, we tend to do an acknowledgement of country. And so this is for the traditional owners of the land. And so I'm normally based in Melbourne on Wurundjeri country, which is, and so I just want to pay my respects to the elders past and present in that land and all they've done over time with innovation and being the original creators. So just with that in mind, I'll keep moving, but I wanted to talk about MedTech Actuator. And so I also have Lizzie, my colleague on the call, who's just jumped in for the beginning of this session, and we just wanted to say hello. So my role within the team is portfolio manager, and basically I work with a lot of our later stage startups on the accelerator program, really when they are at a proof of concept and they're starting to raise capital. They're really trying to navigate how they move forward in terms of like developing a functional prototype, getting that early clinical data, and really getting their product into the hands of clinicians, patients, whoever might be in that validation space. And so we do that through our accelerator program, but we also run another program called Origin, which I'll chat about. So that's sort of where I sit within the team. And then Lizzie, do you just want to quickly introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, of course. Hi guys, I'm Lizzie. I'm the newest member of the MedTech Actuator team. I just joined a couple months ago. I help Makenzie with the accelerator, and I'm also taking the lead on Origin Australia this year. So yeah, if any of you after Makenzie explains a little bit more, if you want to get in touch, I'll drop my email in the chat and you can get in contact with me.
Awesome. Thanks, Lizzie. So yeah, MedTech Actuator, if you haven't heard about us, we are a health venture catalyst and we operate across the Asia Pacific region. And so specifically, we have an office in Melbourne in Australia, but we also have an office in Singapore. There's movement in Japan. We're looking to set up an office there soon. And then, you know, we've been looking at India and some other markets as well. So really kind of spreading our tentacles across the Asia Pacific region and working with healthcare founders to help them build early stage companies and really scale and bring their medical innovations to market. And so we really say that we like to power healthcare startups, and that the programs that we design, the work that we do in those ecosystems really help startups to transform into global companies. And so in that regard, we see ourselves as, you know, a catalyst of innovation and really, you know, a healthcare commercialization initiative that really helps, you know, boost innovation ecosystems, support founders, and drive a lot of benefits into those local spaces. So we've worked with over 200 startups across our programs, you know, and across those companies that have been through our accelerator program and other programs. They have a market cap of $6 billion, and they've raised over $1 billion worth of capital. There is one unicorn within that group, which we proudly claim. And so that's Synchron. I'll talk a bit about them. But we've worked with a lot of different clinicians, academics, researchers, and we unlock a lot of value for government. So based on the money that they put into programs and put into startups, we're able to kind of times that by 17 and really deliver that value back to the ecosystem. And to do this, we work with a lot of partners. So we like to see ourselves sort of as a connector, really in that space, really honing the ecosystem and leveraging the big medical corporates, the local ecosystem service providers like, you know, local angel investors, legal services, medical device companies, whoever it is, to really work with early stage startups so that you can unlock a lot of the barriers and the hurdles and the next steps that you need to do to move forward. So, you know, whether it's Medtronic or down to, you know, working with the local Japanese government, JETRO, or then even working with, you know, some of the local research institutes in Singapore or, you know, hospitals in Australia. We kind of curate all these different players in the ecosystem and put them around the startups so that you can move forward, you can speak to the right people and really get that traction. So some of the companies we've worked with, so Synchron is one of them, similar to Elon Musk's Neuralink. They're developing that BCI for paraplegics to be able to, use computers. They have done a tweet before, I think, just from the brain, just from thinking, which is pretty cool. And they are in first in human trials in the US and valued over $1 billion. And then we have a number of other companies right from like wearable technologies that, smart patches that look at real-time continuous monitoring of vancomycin, right through to sort of fetal lactate monitoring, so minimally invasive biosensors used during labor and childbirth, right through to sort of software platforms that aggregate medical imaging and really try to improve like clinical workflows and the ways that innovation moves through hospitals, and then through to your kind of really exciting mixed reality therapies that are used by first responders to kind of get patient data really quickly, look at heart rates, blood pressure, all those kind of things just from virtual reality glasses. So there's a real big mix in the companies that we work with. And we really say that we sit within anything that's human health innovation and is going to make an impact within the healthcare ecosystem. So that's where we like to sit. If it's regulated, amazing. We know that space really well. So total artificial hearts, which you're working on, would definitely be in that higher regulated space. And it's a really great project to be working on. So it's definitely in our wheelhouse of the companies we have worked with. So just lastly, before I jump into the content, the programs that MedTech Actuator runs, essentially we run 3 different programs. So we have an idea phase program, which is really kind of where you're at in that prototyping, thinking about an idea, thinking about how do you get that started, how do you talk about that. That is our Origin program, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Then we have the accelerator program, again, building that prototype, really trying to figure out what your commercialization strategy is. And then we have a growth stage program, which is about kind of looking at secondary markets and how you can leverage clinical trials in certain areas, or a pilot study in Singapore to leverage the healthcare networks here. So lots of different examples of how we encourage teams to move around to different spaces and really leverage resources to kind of accelerate growth and tap into networks. And then this is all underpinned by Synthesis Capital, our venture capital fund, which is a sister company of MedTech Actuator that funds deep health tech startups in these programs, but also in the ecosystems that we work with. So Origin is, we'll shout out to it because it is currently, it will be as of Thursday, Lizzie, correct me if I'm wrong. It will be open to applications. So if you're based in Australia, this is a really great program if you want to take your project forward. But essentially, it's a similar bootcamp to probably what you're doing now, but we really focus on pitching. There is a prize opportunity there, and you get to network and really tap into the local ecosystem. So if you are based in Australia, particularly in Melbourne, it's a really great program. I won't dive too much into the details because I know you all want to hear about the funding content, but essentially it's a great way to win a bit of non-dilutive funding, meet people, meet other founders who are also facing the same challenges, and then figure out the intricate details of how to actually talk about your idea without disclosing IP, pitching it in the right way, thinking about, okay, what is our commercial strategy and how can we start to piece that together? And so at the end of it, you come out with some great knowledge and a network for life, and potentially a prize if you win too, which is pretty cool. So I'll leave that at this, and then I want to dive into sort of like a funding 101. I know a few of you are online and listening. Does anyone know much about sort of startup fundraising? I'm just trying to get a gauge. If you do, feel free, you can kind of just raise your hand or say nothing. That's totally fine as well. Otherwise, I'll assume you don't know very much, and I'll go with the basics because it can be quite a convoluted space, and there's a lot of acronyms and different pieces that people assume you know, so I'll assume that you don't. And Lizzie, I'll just note if you do have to drop off, that's fine as well. So cool. So funding. Essentially, funding is the make or break of your startup. Particularly if you're looking at total artificial hearts, you are going to need a lot of money to actually produce and get this product to market, and it'll make or break your company. If you can't get any funding, then you will run out of money. Or you will run out of opportunities. You won't be able to access prototyping resources, lab resources, team resources. So it really is make or break, and I'm sure you know this. But I will add on to that the source of funding matters, and how you source it and how you spend it is really important. So funding can come from many different avenues, and this is where it gets interesting because it can change the direction in which you have to take your startup and how things move. So just quickly, the types of funding that I'll run through, I'll talk about equity funding and grant funding mostly, which are the two kind of most common ones. There's also debt funding. So there are places out there where you can get a loan, and then you'll incur that interest in the future. And then there is revenue as funding, which would be great, but in terms of total artificial hearts, you're probably not going to be generating revenue for a while, but power to you if you do, that would be great. Perhaps you do that through consulting or something. So essentially we see that as it's money for the product, but there's also a bit of time and effort involved, and you might not be at that particular point in time to leverage that. So some of the definitions that you will hear over and over again, and I wanted to put them out there first, is that two you'll hear, dilutive and non-dilutive. So we talk about dilutive funding and non-dilutive funding a lot. And essentially, I can see some things. Oh, yeah, that's just Lizzie in the chat. Shout out if you do have a question. Feel free to come off mute and just mention anything or if I'm unclear. But essentially, dilutive funding is where you have to give up a portion of your ownership of the company that you have. So essentially, when you own 100% of a company, and then an investor wants to give you money, but they say, I'll give you $1 million for 25% of your company. This dilutes how much you own of that company, but you're able to get that funding or perhaps some other resource as well. Non-dilutive funding, essentially, that does not require you to give up funding. Give up equity. So you won't lose that portion within your company. You'll maintain 100%, but you do get some kind of resource in return. So we call that non-dilutive. So for example, MedTech Actuator, the program that I just spoke about, that is, it's a 15K in-kind cash and cash prize. So that's 5K cash that is non-dilutive, which is really great. It's $5,000 you can spend on your project. And then there's in-kind mentoring strategy days as well that you receive, where you get in touch with mentors and really great people from the ecosystem. Those are non-dilutive resources. So that's a non-dilutive prize. So this just shows you a little bit about what we call pre-seed, seed rounds, a safe note, and a Series A. So over time, you can see that we have founders here who own founders who own 100% of their company. But then as they move forward and maybe they have a seed round where they raise some capital from an investor, you can see that investor actually takes a portion of their company. And then in that, they also create an option pool, which is essentially a pool of investment funds that over time are able to be accessed by different employees. And then further on, they sign a safe agreement, which I'll talk about in a minute. But essentially that agreement also brings in a bit more investment. And therefore they get slightly diluted. And then lastly, they have a Series A fundraising round, which means they bring in another chunk of funding. And you can see now that the founder has less than half of their company. So over time, they bring in resources, which you desperately need, but the percentage of what you own in the company actually changes over time. We would assume that by a Series A, the value of your company has also grown. So say over here at pre-seed, if your company was worth $1 million, that's great. You own 100% of something worth it at $1 million. But let's say at Series A, your company is worth $30 million and you own half of something worth $30 million, or just under half, according to this diagram. That's even better. So whilst your slice of the pie gets smaller, the value of the pie increases. I'm going to keep speeding through this though, so just jump in if you have any questions about the definitions. So I also wanted to talk about the different rounds. So we throw a lot of terms out there, and I don't exactly know where this emerged from, but essentially the rounds that we have when we raise funding in startups is called pre-seed, which is very early when you're at an idea or sort of you're validating, you've done a bit of validation around your project. Then there is a seed round. So typically what would happen is, you work for 6 months and then you go, right, we need a little bit of money. Let's do our pre-seed round. Then you might work for another 6 months and you go, okay, great. We've used that money, or that money is about to run out. Let's run our seed round. Then you go to the next one. Okay, we've used all that money. Now we need to raise our Series A. So you keep seeing how these rounds go. They move forward over time. And essentially I've tried to made a little kind of matrix about what each of these rounds are and what the rough, where you would be when you kind of launch that round. So where you're at today in terms of you have a proof of concept in a seed round, then you need, the next step for you would be, okay, you want to build that prototype to start gathering that clinical data. So that is why you are actually raising capital, so that you can fund those activities. And so You might be raising between $500,000 to $1.5 million. These are all just suggestions. They're rough amounts, and I have tried to adjust these numbers for MedTech. But again, if you're a total artificial heart, then perhaps you might need a little bit more funding. And I have put these roughly in Australian dollars just because that's where I'm based and that's what I know. But one thing to note is fundraising rounds can keep going. Like, I think, I'm not sure what the biggest round is, but for example, even companies like Airbnb and Uber might be raising like a Series G or something like that. So it goes up, Series A, Series B, Series C, and it just keeps going. And you would hope that you don't need to keep raising money from investors. You'd hope that one day you could sell your company and you would make a lot of money and you would get a return on that investment. But sometimes for some reason, you might want to expand, you might want to grow. So that's why getting that investment capital in can really help you kind of achieve some of those stretch goals and really help you leverage growth opportunities, expanding to different markets. And so that's why you might see beyond a Series B or a Series C, some of those activities. So the last thing to note is a bridging round. So we've seen a lot more bridging rounds more recently because of the current fundraising conditions. We all know there's a bit of economic turmoil at the moment. There's recessions looming and still ongoing. So we are seeing a lot of teams that are unable to raise large amounts of capital. So teams aren't able to raise $5 million because investors are being a bit more they're more risk averse, they're more cautious about what they're investing in, or perhaps they don't have as much funding. So startups are going, right, we're unable to raise $5 million, but we need to achieve X, Y, Z in 6 months. So the minimum amount we need is maybe $400,000. So if you see the word bridging round, it's basically just saying we can't quite do our Series A, or we can't quite do that big capital raise that we want. So we're just going to get a bit of money to bridge us between that point A and point B so that we can really keep moving forward. We're not going to, call it quits on our startup. But we can just keep surviving, not necessarily like thriving or moving on to the next stage, but just to keep moving forward. And that might be particularly goal oriented. And then I've just also put who might actually fund these startups. And so FFF stands for Friends, Family, and Fools. People who really believe in startups at the early stage. And I think maybe we shouldn't call them fools because they're essential, and that's really how teams get started in that pre-seed stage, but essentially raising from individuals in the ecosystem. Then we also have angels, accelerators, university-based VCs, so venture capital funds, and then venture capital funds from the general ecosystem. Then at Series A, you might see venture capital funds and family offices. And then again, Series B, you might even start to get into some institutional investors like big private health insurers, corporate venture capitals, and things like that. And then often in those bridging rounds, you might actually draw on investors that you've already worked with, who are already on your, your who are already shareholders and maybe want to put a bit more money in there. You might match that with grant funding as well. So what we typically see in types of funding in the early stage, there's probably a lot more. It's recommended that you find a lot more non-dilutive funding. Sometimes it's tricky to find, sometimes it's really easy. If you're, some examples are perhaps if you have funding yourself, if you have some savings and you want to put that in, that would be non-dilutive funding. As the founder, you're willing to put in $20,000 to get some things you need to get done. You might raise again from those friends, family, or fools. That can be dilutive or non-dilutive, depending on how you structure things. Again, angel investors, they tend to write small check sizes between like $5,000 or maybe like even as low as $1,000 up to like $50,000 or $100,000. That would be dilutive. They're looking to, give you money in exchange for shares in your company. Then some non-dilutive ones might be pitch competition cash prizes, for example, our program, but I believe this program also has some of those available to you. Accelerators can be dilutive or non-dilutive, depending on how they're structured. So just be aware of that when you are in the early stages. It is important to not, to be careful about how much of your company you are giving away for those resources, and making sure that you do consider each portion of your company that you give away, and make sure that you're getting the right resources or the right funding that you need, and not just kind of like throwing it away. because that may come back to bite you later on. At the later stage of things, we tend to see, more dilutive funding coming from the, when you do raise capital. And then also, things like debt, partnerships. I should probably add grants here as well. A lot of that comes into both of these areas, which would be relevant for you in the sort of medical space. So equity funding, just to wrap up quickly. So essentially, when equity funding comes into play, you are getting money, but you are giving up shares in your company. And so this is raised from some of the people here listed, VC funds, family offices, etc. And there are two typical structures we use when we think about raising capital and giving away equity. So by structures, I mean like a legal document that you would sign. So we see these done as a priced equity round, where you simply say, I want to give you $1 million, which would equate to 100 shares in your company, or whatever the particular setup is. So that is where you would just issue shares to the company directly. They would sign your shareholders agreement, and then happy days, everyone, you have your money, they have their shares. And that is called a priced equity round. Then there are other mechanisms which you can use to make things a bit smoother. I guess there are always legal and tax implications when you someone buys shares off you. So to avoid some of those, there are agreements that are out there called safe notes or convertible notes. So a safe note is a safe agreement for future equity. And essentially that is an agreement that you would sign with someone, and it says, in a lot of legal terms, it basically says, I'm going to give you $50,000 today, and then in the future, when your company is valued at this, or at this date, or whatever the terms are, you will give me this much shares. And so that just means you can issue the shares. Those tax implications come later down the line, but right now you get the cash as the startup, and you can use that cash as you wish. So very popular agreements and very well used across the startup space. And so most investors are very comfortable with either of those mechanisms, but they do have different implications. So it's worth just noting. And then, so obviously the pros with equity funding is that you get network. You not only get funding, that's probably number one, is you get some money, but you get network. You can get connections. So bringing investors into your company is really beneficial because it adds value, it adds people, and they become, they're invested. They are want to see you succeed. They want to help you. They might have expertise and guidance in certain areas. Perhaps they are a group of medical doctors that really want to contribute to the specific healthcare problem that you are solving. So that can be really valuable for your team. It gives you also credibility, and it helps you validate. So again, if you were raising from a group of medical doctors, perhaps they were all cardiologists. And maybe they're leading researchers in their space. So they can really add a lot of credibility to your startup and saying, we have 5 amazing cardiologists that have invested in our company. And they are all on our advisory board. They contribute resources regularly. That can be super beneficial, and it can really make or break your startup to have those key opinion leaders locked in and around what you're building. Some of the cons, obviously, you sell a share of your company, and you also are sharing potential growth in your company as well. Perhaps you even, you might sell the control of your company. Be careful when you start to get into, selling 50% of your company, because then, voting rights change and there's a lot of legal implications. So just be aware that, you might have to give a board seat to one of these investors if they really want one. And then if they have a board seat, what does that mean in terms of votes when it comes to making big decisions? And how does that impact your processes, your workflows, the direction in which your company heads in? It's worthwhile just taking a step back and giving that a good amount of thought. In terms of grant funding, I think it's really important to talk about, because whilst coming from the academic space, coming from research and medical field, grants are well known. You've probably submitted some of them yourself or worked on some. And so it's great. It's non-dilutive funding, but I wouldn't say that it is free money. I'm sure you've all, if you have written a grant application, you'll understand that you have to give up a lot of your time and effort for funding. But in return, you do get grant funding, you do get that money. You might even get some connections if it's particularly associated with a research institute or a charity or something like that. So we tend to see these coming out of like state or federal governments, universities, and then other kind of philanthropic funds or other private sector entities as well. And so project grants are really popular in this space. You would all know this, but we also see match funding. So this tends to be where a grant says, oh, we'll give you $500,000 if you have $500,000 of private capital also invested into this project. And so then that's really attractive for investors, because you can say, hey, we're going to work on a small preclinical trial with the Royal Women and Children's Hospital or wherever it is. They've committed to a $500,000 grant, which if we are able to get $500,000 of investment from the ecosystem, angel investors, venture capital, whoever it is, you then end up with $1 million project or $1 million of funding to move that project forward and really push your startup. So that's fantastic. Match funding is really great, and we see that often in the deep tech area as well. So some of the pros is that you're not giving away that control. If your company grows, you're not kind of losing the benefits to your founders, in terms of that uplift in shareholder value. You still will see the benefits of that. And I guess the community can also see the benefits of the grants. But some of the cons are, yes, applications take time and effort. They are painful. We see a lot of startups knocked back on applications as well. So I'd be really careful and considered around what you apply for and if it's relevant for you. I've seen startups apply for grants that are they're way too early for. So my number one advice with startup related grants, particularly in sort of medtech startups, is reach out to the grant body, the grant provider, and just confirm if you're the right fit. That's all you need to do at the start, is just say, is this us? Here's where we're at. Would you recommend we apply? We would love to, but we don't want to waste our time. So do we stand a chance? And that can save you a lot of time. It can really hone in on how you tailor your application or who you might partner with to submit that. And then I will just add that reporting and compliance is also exhausting, but I'm sure most of you know this if you have navigated that space. So, the deliverables of the grant, it's not just money for nothing. There is a lot of time and effort involved on the start and the end of it. And of course, if you're able to achieve what you want to achieve throughout, then you've got a really great benefit, but just be aware. So in terms of raising funds itself, so it's good to know all these definitions. Random, okay, ignore that little edit on the side. It's good to know these definitions, but essentially there's a lot of research and preparation that goes into raising funds. It's not just, hey, I'm going to reach out to investors and they're going to say yes. There are many different types of investors in the ecosystem, and you need to know exactly what your project plan is and how much everything will cost, because investors will grill you on everything. They do not want to give you money to just go and use however you like. Essentially, you need to say, we are striving for these goals, so we need this much money, and this is how we're going to execute on those goals and how we're going to achieve them. And so you need to determine what that funding need is and how you're going to reduce the risk involved in taking that money from those shareholders, from those investors, and really returning that those benefits to them through the company's growth and through achieving those elements. And so think about how you map out your project so that your fundraising is aligned to goals that will then lead to further fundraising again. So as I was saying, with those different rounds, a seed round, a pre-seed round, a seed round, a Series A, if you're raising a pre-seed round, does that feed into goals that you would then achieve and would attract more investors at your seed round? So for example, if I'm raising a small amount of money now, I just have an idea. If I'm raising money and saying, oh, I'm going to spend it on maybe some marketing materials, I'm going to spend it on paying myself a salary, I'm going to spend it on maybe buying a computer, those things are not really going to move the needle on my business, right? If I spent all that money and then go, right, it's time to raise more money, an investor would look at my medtech startup and say, what have you achieved? What did you spend the money on previously? And I would list out all these things and they say, great, your slides look really good. I can see you're working from a nice computer and that's awesome. And you're happy because you're getting a salary. but what have you done for the startup? And so investors really want to see their money used to move the company forward. And so if you were coming back to that example, if you're raising, if you're looking to fund some activities that would happen at the pre-seed stage, it might be, right, I'm actually going to use this money to file a provisional patent with my IP lawyers because I have a really defensible kind of area that I can work in with my innovation. So that's amazing because then the startup has something protectable. They might also look at, oh, right, you've done some really early prototyping and now I'm at sort of like a looks like, feels like prototype or a functional prototype. So that's something, again, that the startup can see that advancement. So you really need to think about what activities will move you forward and what would reduce the risk for your company and then attract that investment again. So you sort of end up on this hamster wheel. You raise money, you spend the money, you do the things, and then you've got to do it again. And you raise money, you spend money, you got to do the things. But that's how it works because you do become kind of beholden to the investors. And so when you're raising and when you're trying to prepare to raise funding, just really think about where that funding will come from. Do your research. Think about who's most relevant for you, what you need within your team. Is it connections to clinicians? Is it funding from your university, perhaps access to a lab space if you don't have that? Could you access that through your university or through maybe an institution if you want to work with them? And then how you could raise funding from different people who can provide you different things. Maybe it doesn't make sense for you to go and raise money only from clinicians. Maybe you need like a couple of clinicians, a little bit of university funding, and then maybe a large venture capital fund who could potentially, maybe they have an office in the Asia Pacific region so that they can actually give you access to that space and connect you into that area that you're looking to expand into. And so it's your responsibility to really think about that, plan it, and then get ready to execute it. And to execute it, you need a funding toolkit. So this includes like pitch decks. You need to set up what we call a data room, which is where you have a folder that has all the information on your company, all your commercial strategies, all your documentation, your legal and kind of tax documentation ready for an investor to look at. And then even a short list of investors. And I'd recommend you reach out to the ones that you don't want to really get money from first and use them as your test, your trials, and then get out into the ecosystem and start having conversations. And then my last thing to note on this section is that it takes time. So as I was saying, we have those rounds and it might take you 6 months to actually close a round, or in this case, 3 to 4 months. So just be aware that, you have to go out, you have to have these conversations, you have to network. And then even if an investor comes back and says, yes, hey, I'm happy to write you a check, I want to invest, then you have to do the legal and financial process of actually working with those mechanisms that I mentioned before and executing them, making sure that you do sign all the dots, cross all the T's, or dot all the I's, cross all the T's, all of those things. And that process takes some time in itself. So there's the planning of the capital raise, there's the actual capital raise itself, and then there's the kind of closing it out, legal, tying all the things off phase as well. And then you have to start it all again and build the startup at the same time. So I hope I'm not deterring you from starting a startup, but it is a lot. So these were meant to be around the other way, but I wanted to make a point that healthcare startups, they take a long time. Typically we see, and this data is from 2020, so it is a little bit old, but this is the average amount of weeks it takes to close a funding round. And I can guarantee you that it is longer now because of the current economic situation. But essentially healthcare startups really tend to sit at that later end of the spectrum where it takes you a long time to actually close the round. This is partially due to the higher risk that investors are taking with deep tech startups because they have to do due diligence. They want to go away, they want to research at your particular area, they want to dig into your data room, and they really want to dive into the details. If you have IP, if this is research-based work, they want to know exactly what's in it. And so it takes a longer time, and then it takes a longer time to actually make the decision and go, right, have we calculated all the risks right? Have we checked with all our other investors or our lending partners? And then give you a yes. So just be prepared that it's going to take time, is my message on here. So this is from the state there's a report that comes out every year called the State of Australian Startup Funding. Now, this looks crazy. There's a lot of startups that received funding in Australia last year. But what I wanted to point out is that the 2023 teams, the 2023 teams are here. So within the startup ecosystem, there are so many different niche areas. Not all are deep tech, some are more just SaaS, B2B SaaS products. Some are more consumer products, food and beverage. There's lots of different groups, AI, marketplaces, lots of stuff. But health tech and medtech and biotech kind of get categorized into a few different areas. And you can see across all the startups that raised funding last year in Australia, this is where we kind of sit in terms of healthcare innovation and the ability for healthcare startups to raise funding. So it's not even half, I'd say. Well, definitely not half, not even sort of like 25% or a third of startups that raised funding were actually in healthcare. So you are essentially competing against all these other great startups for funding from specific investors. So in terms of Australia, this is what funding looked like last year. So you can see there was 413 deals that were signed. So it is still quite small. In the US, it's obviously a lot bigger, but $3.5 billion was put into startups, which is a significant amount for Australia. I believe this is sort of similar to the level that was last year. I think 2021 was the highest year. You can see on the left. Yeah, they raised about $9 to $10 billion. That probably was in the era of like when Canva was raising some capital, and also Mr. Yum is another really big startup that was raising in around 2021. So a really big year, but you can see here that we're kind of back down at that 2020 level. So we've actually kind of gone backwards. And there were no new unicorns, which is where a startup has a $1 billion valuation. And then across Australia, you can see that, the majority of the funding actually goes to New South Wales. So Sydney, startups based out of Sydney, has a really strong, thriving startup ecosystem. But interestingly, in terms of the top 6 sectors of capital raised, MedTech and biotech is up there. So if we go back here, it doesn't look like, in terms of the 413 startups that raised funding last year, it doesn't seem like medtech and biotech, this section over here, would be part of one of the top 6 sectors, but actually they raise quite a bit of money. I mean, we know that if you're developing something like a total artificial heart, you will need a lot of capital to actually move that product forward, to make it, to get your prototype functioning, everything involved in the materials, through to the team you need. That will take a lot of effort and energy, but then also actually going through your clinical trials and the resourcing and funding you need, the amounts that you need to raise are a lot higher than, say, a B2B SaaS company that can just go, oh, we only need to do one funding round. We just need to make a quick prototype. It's not quick, but we need to make a prototype, and then we're going to start generating revenue straight away. So because medtech and biotech does take longer to get to market, you'll need to raise more capital. And so it is exciting that we see medtech and biotech in one of the top 6 sectors. And there's a little bit more information there. The report is really interesting. Of course, we would love to see more female founders or mixed gender teams getting funding, but you can see they're still sort of only participating in sort of around 25% of the 413 deals that were closed last year. So it's not ideal, but it is, those numbers are up from 2022. So it is interesting. So in terms of medtech, biotech, and health tech, these are the 2022 numbers, and for Australia only. So just to give you a sense of the different, the amount of deals that we're seeing over the past, so 2020, 2021, and 2022, it definitely went up, which is really exciting. Australia has a really thriving life sciences, health tech, medtech, biotech sector, particularly in Melbourne. And so we see a large number of deals receiving funding in 2021 and 2022. So if we look at the 413 deals from last year, let's assume that maybe, like almost 20% of them are from sort of medtech, biotech, health tech, which is great. And then just to show you sort of the different sizes of the rounds, so the value of those deals, so the average, you can see how a seed round is really around that $1 to $2 million mark across the years. Then Series A tends to be between, 7.8 to 10 million. So you're really looking at a small, growing that round, raise that amount of funding. And then it gets quite larger as you go up into Series B and beyond. I wish they had the pre-seed value here as well. I think that would be really interesting to see how much early stage startups are raising. And then essentially you need to think about what your problem that you need to solve for investors is how to get to that next value inflection point. So I sort of talked about that earlier, where you need to think about, right, we're at point A and we want to get to point B. And we need to make sure point B is still, valuable for our company. So how much money do we need in between? So you need to have a good sense of cash flow, the expenses, the runway. And so again, these are all kind of little problems that you need to start solving and going, right, what are all those activities? How much do they cost? Can we get quotes? Can we actually confirm some of those numbers? Which ones do we need to prioritize? Which ones fit into sort of that pre-seed or the seed level? And then which ones fit into sort of the later kind of stages that we want to do? And then how do they all connect together? And how do we actually create some cash flow and map out those expenses so that we have what we call runway, which is essentially how much money you have to sort of get you to, it's like, think of a plane, how much money do you have to get to take off? And does that runway keep going, or are you going to run out of runway at some point and just kind of crash and plummet into the earth? So really think about how you can keep that cash available for your company before you go, right, we need to raise money. So essentially you need to kind of go, right, I can see our runway is running out. We need to raise some money ASAP. Let's do it. Then do the same thing again and the same thing again. And then think broadly and strategically about how you can leverage non-dilutive and dilutive funding, but use your time wisely. And then leverage your network. So if you are at a research institution or you're at a university, speak to your tech transfer office. They can offer a lot of advice. But also speak to different academics. Reach out to your startup space. Often universities have an innovation hub, or they might have a particular startup accelerator. Go to them, ask them for resources. They always do events, programs. So if you haven't looked at those support services, reach out to them. Some opportunities for startups. So I'm nearing the end of my presentation, so I will try to finish up early. But essentially, there are so many resources out there for startups. And I highly recommend you take advantage of them. Obviously, you're in this competition, you're working on your total artificial hearts. So that's fantastic. There are lots of cash prizes and other prizes, connections to mentors that come out of pitch competitions. So don't hesitate to, scour the internet for MedTech pitch competitions. They exist and there is a lot of them, and they can all bring you different resources, different mentors to kind of help you move things forward. And then of course we have pre-accelerators or accelerators and incubators. So these are, short to long-term programs that really provide you with a set of resources and put a lot of support around you to help you build your startup and work on that commercialization strategy. Some of them come with like maker spaces, or they might come with access to a lab space, or they might come with access to like resources. Some do, some don't. So just be aware of what kind of resources you need and what those programs offer, so that you can make the most of your time and really support your team to like really level up your knowledge and get ready for what's next. And then think about that investment again. So we see that as an opportunity, it's an investment. It's a resource you 100% need, and so it can help you really kickstart that business. Here are some programs. These are Australian based, so I won't run through them, but of course, if you are based in Australia, you can also think about joining some of these programs. I mean, of course, we're at the top of the list, but there are a bunch of others there. If you are like more in the biotech space, or if you're in the disability space, there's programs for you. And then there's a few of the others. You can go, these are all kind of med tech focused, but you can also look at kind of agnostic. I'd imagine they would probably not work too closely with any total artificial heart teams like MedTech. That's quite a deep MedTech startup. So you might have a bit of trouble going to like your YC Combinator, which is a really well-known startup accelerator, but perhaps Techstars, like they do run a MedTech version of that program. So these are available to you. And then of course, MedTech Innovator runs across the US and the Asia Pacific region, but they are more for later stage startups. So you can kind of jump in and out of programs depending on where you are, what you need. See how you can use a startup program like MedTech Actuator, our pre-accelerator, then our accelerator, then perhaps looking at some of the more growth stage programs. If you're looking to get into the US, what exists there? I do know there is a cardiology focused Accelerator, which I probably should have put on this, but anyway. Then here are just some Australian resources. So you can kind of click through the documentation. I will send these slides and these will be linked, but essentially my advice to anyone in general, no matter where you are, look at your startup kind of festivals that are in and around your ecosystem, volunteer for them. Like I did this when I was in university. I lived in Montreal for a little bit, and I know Montreal has a startup festival. So I volunteered for that, and I got to go, I got a free ticket, I saw a bunch of cool things, and I got to know more about the ecosystem and then tap into sort of like my network building as well. I would recommend you follow venture capital firms, accelerator programs, founders you are like inspired by, and also startups you like on LinkedIn. It might feel a bit icky to have to network and to use LinkedIn. Like I've had friends say to me, you actually use LinkedIn? But yes, everyone in the startup ecosystem uses LinkedIn, sometimes a bit too much, but it's a really great resource for figuring out like what programs are on, when things are launching, free events that you can go to, who's who in the ecosystem. So follow people on LinkedIn and start using it if you really want to build a startup. And then become a member of your local startup ecosystem or tech community or MedTech community, whatever it is, and then just get involved. Like it is, yeah, it's really nice going to different meetups where you meet other founders. If you're building your own company, it can feel quite lonely at times. So definitely leverage the ecosystem around you. And then this is it. So before I send these back, I'll add our emails into the slides just if you want to reach out about anything. But me and Lizzie are here. And that is everything in my slides. So I hope that was useful. I hope you got some of those definitions like cleared up in your mind. So I'm saying where things fit, and then got a bit of advice around fundraising too.
Thank you, Makenzie. That was great. There was a lot of information. I hope it's going to be helpful for the teams. Does anyone of the people attending here has any questions? I think we've got like 10 minutes left. It's your chance.
I was wondering, on one of your slides, you had like graphs of the like an ownership at the different stages. I was just wondering like, how many companies that would be. Would it be like one company owns 30%, or would it be like 10 companies?
It depends. So do you mean as the founder, like how much you own, and then who else is on who owns your company?
Yeah, so I think like you said in the pre-seed you own like 100%, and then the seed you might own like 70, and then after Series A maybe like less than 50 or something.
Yeah. For everyone it's different. So I mean, if you don't need to give away any of your company, I'll just say you don't have to. But it really depends. So we essentially, when you list all of the people who own shares in your company, it's in a document called a cap table, a capitalization table. So in a cap table, it can be, I mean, it starts to get a bit weird if it's like up in the thousands, in the hundreds, but typically in the early stages, we see it as about like maybe up to 10 different people. And so when I say people, it could also be companies. So it could be, for example, you as the founder, perhaps you have a co-founder. So that's already 2 people who are on your cap table. Then maybe you speak to an angel investor. So then it would be the name of that angel investor also on your cap table. Then perhaps maybe you're working with your university, and so they might, maybe there's some IP that you are negotiating with them because, you know, it's your academic research, or you use their lab space or something. So perhaps they own a small piece of equity in your company. So that could be, they could be also be on your cap table. And then perhaps there's a VC, or perhaps you've had a partnership. So you can kind of build this puzzle piece however you like, and it changes every time. So the number is different for every single company, and how it looks over time changes. But I guess you can kind of, it's your company, so you can kind of have that control and be very strategic in who you accept investment from, and how you kind of share that, or who you give shares in your company to. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Cheers.
No worries. And we see lots of different things. My advice is to be really cautious and just really consider, right, is this the right person? Because essentially, like, you give away shares in your company and you might be stuck with that person for the next 5 to 7 years if you are taking this all the way. And so if they're an asshole, perhaps you don't want to take money from them. So it's not abnormal to say no to investors as well. Just remember that. You be very careful about who you choose to give your equity to.
Okay, nice.
But of course, yeah, sometimes you get desperate. So got to do what you got to do. Any other questions? I'll just check the chat. Yeah, I'll make sure you get the slides, and I'll put our details in there so you can reach out if you are if you're ever in a tricky situation. I would just reach out to, like, if you are attached to a university, like, reach out to them. If you have built your network, like, don't hesitate to soundboard with other founders and say, hey, have you met this investor before? They want to do this crazy thing, or someone is promising to help us raise $1 million. Sounds too good to be true. Have you heard of them? Don't hesitate to sort of sense check things with your ecosystem, or with people around you, or, you know, my email is going to be in the slides, so feel free to throw things my way too. Always happy to help and provide advice. Not legal advice, but general soundboarding advice.